And now, without further ado, let me introduce you to Esther. Esther Trapadoux is a growth marketer with over 15 years of experience in B2B and software as a service. Passionate about learning from users, analytics, and solving complex problems, Esther is currently building a community at Amplitude and solving the existential crisis of community-led growth. Esther, let me welcome you to the stage to speak a little bit about building a product community. Thank you very much for being here with us. Can we join hands for Esther? The stage is all yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Esther. I don't usually give talks at conferences, so I'm a little bit nervous. I'm actually always behind a screen working, which is what I enjoy most. But what I wanted to talk to you today was about building a product community. I think this is a topic that's a very, very old one, but kind of resurfacing as a new way to introduce growth into a product and create relationships with between a vendor and a user, essentially. But a little bit about me first. So I'm Esther. I'm originally from California. I live in France. I've been a marketer my entire career, and the use of data and analytics has been a really important part of my journey because I started in content. Nobody takes that very seriously because everyone can write. And I noticed using data, becoming really good with analytics was just a huge part of finding my own voice. And that's why for me working at Amplitude, and I started working there about 2 years ago, has been just amazing because Amplitude, if you guys don't know, it is a product analytics platform. It's kind of like Google Analytics, or there's a bunch of other tools on the market, and it allows you to track user behavior. And it's whatever. It's a really good tool, but it's only useful if you actually use it, with any data. And so I wanted to talk about why a community for a company like Amplitude, or maybe lots of different SaaS products, is important. But first, I wanted to take you on a little bit of a journey and tell a little bit story. So once upon a time, there was a company called Amplitude. And we actually saw a lot of different islands being forged with different users living on different islands. And they were kind of surrounded by a sea of data and analytics. And more islands came up as our user base grew. And so as we looked out from the Amplitude's perspective, we saw a lot of different islands popping up, a lot of data surrounding them. But they didn't really have each other. And so we saw that growth was pretty stifled. And then from the trenches, from our own front lines, whether it was on marketing and sales, but especially from the support and customer success side, we saw these different smoke signals from our users. And they were really asking us that they needed a place to connect with each other. They needed a place to learn. And they really needed a place to grow with each other, not just with the product, not just with Amplitude. And so I asked ourselves, imagine if we can create an ecosystem and create a world where we have not just Amplitude, not just the product, but we have our users connecting with each other, connecting with partners in a different way, and then also connecting in a way where they can start sharing and spreading best practices. And we thought this could be the Amplitude difference. Right? And this is kind of an important thing because there are, as we all know, a lot of analytics tools out there, a lot of BI tools. There's good old Excel, which I like to revert back to. But what would be the difference in Amplitude, the platform, and then also as a group of users? So we set out to do this, and I learned a few things in the last 7 months, because that's when I became this accidental community builder. So I went from growth marketer to community person about 7 months ago. And I guess, I don't know if anyone here has ever built a community before or is involved in community building, because this might feel really basic. OK, it's going to feel basic to you. But here's the stuff that I learned that we tested in a couple of frameworks that might be useful if you're thinking about building a community for yourself or for your product. So a couple signs that a community would be valuable, because it's a big undertaking, and maybe you shouldn't have one. Some of the things that we saw were users were trying to solve a wide range of use cases. right? So it wasn't a really simple tool. It was interesting and complex enough that people from different functions, different industries, and different growth models were using Amplitude, and they were being very, very creative about it. Another thing is we had a shift in the user base. So Amplitude is like 15, 16 years old. It got its roots in the Bay Area. It was very like, yeah, tech and like all of these early adopters in the digital space. Motivation was really, really high. And so even though there was a lot of friction to getting started and using the product and getting your data in and like running a bunch of visualizations, because the user base was motivated, they kind of forgave us for all of those things. But there's only so many like early pioneers and transformers that you can get. And once like a market and a product matures, you end up with like this, I would say like early majority, right? And so they're a little bit less motivated. The maturity in this case with analytics is probably a little bit lower, and they give up more easily. And that also gives us like an interesting signal that like maybe we need to do a little bit more, aside from the traditional tactics of like having an academy or having really good customer success and support. Another signal is we saw like really interesting dense groups of growing like groups, right? So we saw like pockets of like I would say user types, but then even also in countries as we were expanding in like smaller regions, and then also industries we're continuing to adopt, and then we saw like these dense pockets of growth as well. And then something about Amplitude and maybe just analytics products in general is it's not something that you talk about naturally. It's not super interesting. It's difficult to share. There is also a lot of like weird insecurity when it comes to data and analytics. People feel stupid. One thing that I get is like a lot of people don't want to share their data because they're embarrassed about their conversion rates, which that's fine. Like we all have low conversion rates, no big deal. But it's something that there isn't like a natural like network effect or viral loop. And this is a bit like how those signs, these signals actually look like in real life. So we saw like a lot of custom formulas, a lot of interesting dashboards. We have this thing called notebooks, and the users are using notebooks a lot. And we thought like, okay, there's something interesting happening here where people are finding some very cool tricks in Amplitude that like other users might be able to like learn from. The shift in the user base, like what we kind of measured as a shift in the user base was a drop in activation rates. So where it used to be very easy to get new users onboarded and activated and building their first chart, we've been like struggling with a really large drop in activation rates. Part of it is because we have a free plan and people come with different types of intent. But in general, like this is a pretty problematic signal, right? Like not good for business. And then we were seeing customer growth in really specific segments. There are some super interesting, and I think COVID was probably helpful with that. But there are some interesting industries where we're seeing a lot of growth and revenue and traction on the digital product side, which feels super obvious. But like these were new things for a lot of teams. It meant like a new go-to-market motion. It meant understanding users in a different way. It meant maybe like measuring retention curves for the very first time. So we saw like these little groups of people where like maturity and growth was happening at different rates. And then finally, and one thing with Amplitude is it contains sensitive information, right? It contains your data, it contains information about your user base, your like lifetime customer value, and these are things that are really hard for companies to share. In addition to not wanting to share necessarily with people like what your strategy looks like. And those analytics kind of reveals a lot of those things, especially the experiments that you're running. So all of these signals are like pretty interesting signals. Like maybe we need to start connecting, creating a network, and creating a community. So a couple reasons why you maybe shouldn't start a community. Aside from the fact that it's really, really hard, as everyone says, it's actually really, really hard. If there's nobody really asking for a community except for the business, this is a really good signal that maybe you don't need one because it's like purely motivated by the business, and it'll be really clear that like nobody really has a need for this, so like why build it? The second thing, and it's slightly different, is the business only has business outcomes in mind. And so when a company only has business outcomes, and it may sound like how many new users did we get from our community? How many new opportunities did we open from our community? How much revenue did we generate from our community? Which are fair questions. If those are the only questions, then you've essentially just created a new audience for marketing and sales. That's not a community. There's no relationship there. It's purely still like unidirectional, where the company is asking something from a bunch of people. I think the third one is actually really important. Is there are already a lot of communities doing the exact or similar thing. And there are a ton of communities out there on all different platforms. And I think respecting how you use people's time and deliver value, like, it needs to be enough. So you need to be able to create enough value that's differentiated from other communities. If you can't, then the best thing for you to do is to support those other communities. And that's actually another incredible way for growth. But it's not really, it's sort of like a really, I don't know how to say it, but it means, like, it kind of takes a lot for you to decide that I'm going to build my own community. It assumes a lot of what the other communities are lacking, and maybe they're not. And then finally, there's not enough resources to build, grow, and maintain a community. And I think the hardest part here is the first growth stage, which is getting through your cold start problem, where you're starting to build a community, you have like maybe a few people, nobody's really engaging, and you're like pumping a lot of activity to manufacture engagement and manufacture content creation. Like, that's okay, but it's going to take probably 5 to 6 months to start to see traction. So if you're not really committed and dedicated to doing that, like, then it's going to be really difficult for the community to survive and move past that. So why community specifically, right? Like, why this instead of other types of go-to-market motions and other strategies to connect? So there's always going to be tension in the vendor and user relationship, right? Like, you have the vendor on one side, you have the user on the other side, and you have a bunch of things in the middle where you have your go-to-market strategy, which looks like sales and marketing. You have your product, absolutely. Like, that sits in between that relationship. And then your customer success team as like your front lines. The problem with this dynamic is it's really kind of one way. Everything, all of the pressure is on the customer in order to give something, whether it's revenue, product usage, and like a lot of times, like, the vendor is winning a lot and the customer is getting some value, but there isn't like a really healthy loop happening here. And that's where community comes in. This is where it creates like this central focus between the vendor and the user that's more than just the product, and that's more than just generating revenue off of somebody or a specific company. And in addition to this, which is actually the most exciting thing, is you have potential users that can enter your community. So there are a lot of great communities out there where it's like led by a vendor, but you don't necessarily have to be a user of that product in order to like learn a lot and gain a lot of value out of that. So this tension is what community does a pretty nice job of solving, is it relieves some of the burden on like an overly product-specific conversation. The next one is we know that communities are actually really, really powerful business levers. So if you look at the different types of loops to acquire new users, you have your viral loops, which for Amplitude specifically is really difficult. Like, people don't always share about how they're using analytics. We have content loops, but the problem I think with this is a lot of company-generated content is either overly salesy, overly marketing, or overly thought leadership, and like it's really difficult to move the needle and influence topics that are based on thought leadership. And then paid loops, which, one, much less effective these days, and then two, it's really difficult to scale paid loops, right? Like, you're just gonna end up pouring money into ad sales, and you really just want like the most high intent, eager to buy people that you're targeting with these paid loops. And community, it turns out, does a really good job with creating viral loops and creating content loops through user-generated content. The second thing is that product communities are renowned for strong retention. And I think that's because we know that users, especially as products become more complex, they can't go it alone, right? Whether they're a new user going through setup, which is typically a problem for an analytics platforms like ours. But even like aha and habit moments are much better done through communities because of use case sharing, because they can like generate relationships and then also take that product knowledge into their next role, maybe find their next job. So all of these things are like, really good reasons on why a business might think a community is a good solution for their go-to-market problems. But which communities, like are communities actually value and useful enough for users? So there is a really famous model in the community world called Spaces. And it's great because it kind of gives you a definition of why your community exists. There's like this support community, pure troubleshooting. I think a lot of early stage startups kind of do this in order to get through like their support problems. Product community, which, Tableau, Salesforce, DBT, great examples of amazing product communities. And then it bleeds over into acquisition. This is an interesting thing because your content and your community programming has to be agnostic enough where it can appeal to a wide range of different users and different platform users. And then it continues down through contribution, engagement, and success. These are harder levels to achieve, and you have to build like pretty thoughtfully for each space because each one of those are going to dictate the kind of programming that you have and the way that you're measuring success and supporting your users. So how do you build one, right? Like, now that you have figured out like why you would want one, what are the business objectives, if you even should have one, what are some of the things that you should do to potentially build one? So like the way we started this at Amplitude, and I don't know if this is the best way to do it, but we did a lot of work in identifying exactly who we're going to target. And that ended up being like practitioners, right? Like people who actually used Amplitude versus targeting people who might make a decision to buy an analytics platform. Sometimes they're the same, but as companies get bigger, they're very, very different. And we intentionally didn't want to build a community for people who might have budget, but they would never use the platform. So we did this like really, really big mapping exercise. And we looked at like the different types of people that tend to use Amplitude, but then like what would be like the intersections of work between them. So we have like our whole like data squad over here, lots of different data titles that might use Amplitude for some reasons. There's growth and marketing and product over here, growth and product. There's definitely like an analytics pod happening, and then some revenue and some operations. And there was a lot of different intersections of work. And one thing is we stepped back and we thought, we clearly can't build a community for all of these people. That would make for, frankly, a very boring community. It'd be really difficult to deliver value for like such a diverse range of needs and goals. So we narrowed these things down, and we had like this prioritization heuristic of what we thought would be valuable to other users, and also like where we could get the most amount of content generated. And that could look like conversations, relationships, or content, and then your classic like user-generated contents in terms of more custom formulas being shared, or more templates, or more dashboards. And we transformed and we had this very long list of which profiles we would want to target. A lot of intense debate internally because as all companies, we think everybody wants everything. And we came down to like these three key markers, three key personas with different markers based on where they are in their career, what type of company and size company that they work for, because that changes the influence and practitioner level that they have. How technical or non-technical they are, because it's an analytics product, but we really serve product teams. And then we tried to understand, like, are they more on the execution side, or are they making strategic decisions? Because that would also inform the kind of content that we would want to have. And then a big thing here, and it's really hard to read down here, but this says lacking confidence, and this says confidence. And that was a big hypothesis that we had in our minds, was people join communities because they don't feel confident about something. So it could be in the moment they don't feel confident about a specific question and they want an answer, or potentially they don't feel confident in their skills, right? About their ability to influence decisions as a product person, or their ability to influence product teams as an analytics person. So we also wanted to played with this idea of people join communities out of a lack of something, and we thought that lack of something was a lack of confidence. And then on this side, we were really clear, and this is specific to the category that we're in, which is product analytics, and there are like tons of thought leaders, tons of influencers, tons of subject matter experts, and we knew that we needed to bring them in early in order to get a bit of like a content wheel going until it started to generate stuff itself. And then, so we took like all of those things of the intersection of work, who we thought that we needed to target, at which level of like operations and practitioner that we needed to understand. And then we took these 4 elements of strong communities. And this is from a really good book called The Business of Building. If you're thinking of starting a community, I recommend that book. There's a lot of community content out there. Most of it is bad. That's a very good book. And the 4 different pillars of community building of a strong community is, do you have clearly defined membership? Do people know why they belong here and where they fit into the community? Like, is this a place for them? The second is there an exchange of influence, which is kind of interesting. And the exchange of influence really means, like, are they heard? So when they go into a community and they drop a question, or like, they see other people like dropping questions, like, does that influence somebody else? Like, does that influence a community manager to actually reply, or other members to reply? So I would take this as like, am I heard in this community, or am I just kind of shouting into the void? And that's also a key indicator of whether or not you have a strong community. The third one is like, are my needs being fulfilled? And those needs will change over time, but when you first join, you probably have a very specific immediate need. I want to find an analytics job. Why is this chart broken? I can't get my data. I'm missing user. Like, these are all things that we hear. And so is that need immediately met? Is there immediate value exchange? And then can we grow that over time? And then the 4th thing, really hard, is a shared emotional connection. And for me, this is the difference between community and marketing. So with marketing, we might tell you all of the amazing features of Amplitude. On the customer marketing side, we might tell you how to build these different charts in Amplitude. But on the shared emotional connection side, we're talking about your job. We're not just talking about the product itself, how to use it, get others in your team to use it. We're talking about the problems that you have with road mapping, with prioritization, the fact that like nobody uses data to make decisions, but they just like copy paste charts into a Jira ticket, right? Like, there's something here, and it looks like rants. It looks like shared successes, and it looks like a lot of like sounding board and brainstorming. This is, I think, the best part of community. And so we did what everybody else would do in this situation, because community is a product like most things, is we looked at every single step of the user journey, from acquisition through setup, aha, habit, and then who are our different users. In our case, we have teachers, we have learners, and we have lurkers. Lurkers are great. They're over 90% of the community, but they play a very different role from teachers versus learners. So we took our user journey, and we thought, okay, fine. Teachers and learners, people who have really strong habits, getting a lot of value, specific questions, immediate need, they're content creators. They're asking questions, they're answering questions, they're sharing cool things about their work. They're going beyond Amplitude. And then lurkers are content consumers. Also super important. We have like several hundred lurkers in our community, and I think to downplay them by only looking at our active members sort of negates everything. Like, I think LinkedIn is a good example of how it's a really thriving community with a ton of lurkers that get a lot of value out of it. Because frankly, posting on LinkedIn is scary. And then we mapped it back to those pillars of like, what does a strong community look like? There's the membership part of it, and we try to make that extremely clear in the acquisition, whether it's through content design, the partners that we have, or like the solutions, the experts that we bring in to talk about subjects. And there is a lot of like these like secret design elements that come into acquisition to let people know like the vibe of the community. For example, like there are a lot of influencers that we can work with, but I only choose the ones who are super open about talking about failure really open about like being vulnerable and like talking about how things are hard, because I think that's why people tend to join an analytics community, because there's a lot of failing, things are hard, and there are a lot of challenges. We don't need another community, at least from my perspective, where everybody's perfect. In the setup moment, we think about needs, like what's your immediate need and why did you join here, and like how can we deliver on that as quickly as possible. And then influence is a big thing for aha moment. So getting people to post in intros, getting people to post a question, getting someone to talk to me, like I try to pull that out as much as possible because I want them to have an immediate feedback loop. Someone's going to reply, you're going to be seen, you exist in the community, like you're visible. And then the emotional connection really gets reinforced in this habit moment. One thing that I did notice, though, is the emotional connection happens very, very early, probably in setup when there's a content creator. Content creators are like fast, they want to get out there, and like they want to actually connect with somebody very, very quickly. So it's not always in this order, but this is kind of how we build, and we optimize our onboarding journey, the first week of welcoming you into the community, and then helping you find a connection very quickly. Like all of these things are stuff that we're testing out in each stage of this journey. And then these are just some questions that we tend to ask in each stage, just trying to understand, like an acquisition, like who can join. I won't go through each one right now, but this was a really big question because the business was very firm on like Amplitude customers must be the only ones who can join this community. And everything has to be Amplitude branded and Amplitude. And I spent a lot of time talking to the business and trying to convince them like nobody actually cared and that they have like their own lives and like their own jobs to go back to, and Amplitude is like a tiny portion of like what they really care about in the world. And I think after a while they like realized, or at least they accepted for like 1 year, that we wouldn't be all in on Amplitude. And so far, the bet is kind of paying off. Like you can be anybody. We have like our competitors in there, employees of our competitors in there. We have our competitors' users in there. And like quite frankly, I think like when I think about a company like Amplitude, which is little analytics platform, is our biggest competition are simply people who don't use analytics. It's not another platform. It's just people who are struggling to use data, who are struggling to like know which questions to ask, and who are lacking the skills. And that's the real competition that we're facing. And we were really, really clear in all of our branding and all of our messaging that it's open to everybody, as long as you have like a desire to learn. And every single step of the way, you could see that there are different questions that we ask to really figure out like how we should build for that part of the user journey. And then from there, there's like a lot of frameworks and systems like go into community building. So from there, we thought about the community ecosystem, because communities are about like many to many. So if you think about like a digital product being one to many, a customer success is like one to one, a support forum is maybe one to many. A community is many to many, and that means there are a lot of players in this ecosystem. And we have influencers, they create large group dynamics, great for acquisition plays. People are there to learn. We have like our expert practitioners, they look like vendors, solutions partners, really incredible power users. Those are the best. They create small group connections. They share like either in an event that's async or sync, and people are there to practice the stuff that they've learned. And then we have like members themselves that are like new, maybe lack confidence, and they're really there to foster one-to-one connections with each other or with an Amplitude employee. And then we have Ampliteers, people who work at Amplitude. And everyone is playing a different role at different times as we think about like people who are learning and practicing, and then finally going on to teach. And this is just like how we envision like the different core elements of a strong community maps to the different players of the ecosystem and the value that they're delivering. So for just like out of pure transparency, we're pretty good at figuring out the influencer play. This is like the most copyable, least differentiated play. Anybody can get this to get an influencer to talk. You either have to have connections or money. So this is obviously the easiest thing, it's great for acquisition, delivers a little bit of value, but if that's all we did, this is just marketing. We're not great at like creating the small group and one-to-one member connections, but so much testing is happening here because this is relationship building and this is starting to have like many-to-many value creation. Where we are very bad at are Amplitude employees actually being in the community. And this is kind of a caveat of like, should a company actually build a community? Like, yes, we definitely should. We've seen so much growth. However, if a company is not willing to invest and give as much as our members, then there's something missing here. And this is not like a lack of desire. It's purely a lack of resources. And it's like, these are the hard questions that we're asking ourselves now and that we'll ask ourselves in 2024 is like, we should properly prioritize the role of a community. Every product person should be answering questions and establishing relationships. Product people only have 24 hours their day and they work hopefully less than that. So like it doesn't always add up, and we're like thinking about like what are the resources, what are the metrics and the targets that we need to establish in people's performances to make sure that they're adequately motivated in their own jobs. It's not just a volunteer situation here. And this is a lot of internal stakeholder management. I don't know, quite frankly, I'm not very good at this stuff, but like we're making strides along the way. And then we're still answering some really interesting existential questions about who we're marketing to and which metrics we really want to move. The reason why this is existential is if you're overly focused on business outcomes, then you build for the wrong thing, right? Like you build for like a direct marketing and direct sales play. It's too fast. There's no relationship. There's no shared emotional connection. On the other hand, if we're not really clear about who we're building with, then it's confusing. Like, why does this community exist and what am I going to get out of this? Right now, we're building for all three of these, and it's tough, right? People are still wondering, like, why am I here? You know, like, is this an Amplitude community or is it not? And so we're like slowly shifting and understanding this balance, but this is your classic, like, you can't build for everyone. We're going to have to make some really tough choices. And we're going where there's demand, we're going where there's immediate need, and where there's immediate value that can be created. And so far, it's been doing pretty well. So we launched about 7 months ago, and we've been growing. There was some hard months over there in the beginning where there was very little traction happening, lots of questioning, why does it all matter? But we've been starting to see some interesting signs of growth lately. And I think more so, I always ask people, do you have a friend in this community other than me? I ask everybody that in our community because I want to know, like, where is the hive? Like, where is the network? And people are starting to answer that they've made connections with other people. And I think this is like a really clear sign of like, something is finally happening, right? It's not just me forcing this community flywheel to turn. Something is actually happening. And not that like huge numbers matter, because I do think there is an interesting correlation of like the quality of content in communities actually decrease as community sizes increase, but we're still getting there. So a couple of tips and tricks. This is a lot. The first one is talk to members regularly. I talk to like 10 to 15 members a week. I could probably talk to more. Every single new member, like, I aggressively ask them if they want to get on one-on-one with me. This is how I spend a lot of my time. It's such an excellent way to learn about the needs, find practitioner experts. And the big thing is it gets members from 0 to 1 immediately, just after that call. The second thing is like community is really just domain authority, right? Like select a very specific topic that you want to own and then just keep testing and iterating. Is this the topic that you should own? For us, we saw a ton of product communities, lots on like leadership, cross-functional, blah, blah, blah. And there was a lot of like analytics community, very, very technical. But we didn't see an intersection of both, where people were talking about how they're using data to make decisions. Some people were saying, I'm the only person that wants to use data in my company, please help. Like, these are the people that we're trying to help and inform them like how they can be more effective in their roles. Another question is like, why does the world need another X community? So I have a mentor, he used to work at Amplitude. And every so often, he like pops into my DMs and he says, "Did you figure out why this place exists?" And it breaks my heart like every single time. But it's a very good question to ask yourself. The third thing is aggressively journey map every single step in the member experience. Just because it's a community that lives in different spaces doesn't mean it's not a product, right? If there's an experience that you're getting users or members through, all the way from like acquisition through retention, and also do the same with other communities. Like how are they going through their maps, like their journeys, and what are they setting up? This last one is make your North Star something you can't measure easily. So I get a lot of questions from the business. How many active members do we have? How much did we grow month over month, quarter over quarter? This is not a good sign of a healthy community. Like maybe it's some sort of indicator of a community that's showing growth, but it doesn't mean that it's strong or healthy and anyone can game those numbers. For us, we picked confidence, and we tried to figure out all the proxy metrics for what does confidence look like. Do you invite a team member? Do you post? Do you share this community with someone on your network? Like those might be signs of confidence, and we're still trying to figure out like how do we actually measure and quantify this, and are we seeing growth over time? And then a couple like fluffy tips and tricks. One is set clear guardrails with the rest of the go-to-market team. So again, you didn't create a community in order to create another direct marketing and direct sales channel. Once you get to a certain space, it'll start to become interesting for sales teams and marketing teams because they'll look at it as a channel. If anyone calls your community a channel, like immediately shut them down. Like this is not what you have created. So I think just for me, I spent a lot of time actually siloing community, keeping it out of Salesforce, keeping it out of every database I could find at Amplitude until I felt like we were like strong enough to have a say at the table and say this is how it should actually fit into the process. The second thing is model the behavior you want to see in members. Really important that you need to give and give and give, and only then will members feel confident and safe enough to give in return. And this, I don't think this ever ends. So communities that don't have like a strong group of members who are always giving and modeling the behavior you want are ones that probably are on a slow decline. The third thing is set an incredibly high bar for quality. Community is essentially another media brand for your company. And so the bar for quality needs to be excellent. And that doesn't mean people who have like achieved everything in the world, they may not necessarily be excellent. But like the practitioners, the ones who are figuring it out, the ones who are in there every single day, like not giving up, this is the bar of quality that you want to hit for them. And like, you don't want to let them down. They should also be creating content. And the last thing for any community member or builder is like push through that cold start program problem. Like I know it's really hard to get through. I know it might feel quiet when you first started a community, but I think stay true to your first principles and why you started this and why it exists, like why you thought it should exist, and likely what you'll put into it, like you'll start to see some returns down the line. But in the beginning, it's quite hard. You can always call me, like I know how hard it is, so I'm happy to like give you a bit of advice too. That's it for me. Oh, also, join our community.
Thank you very much, Esther, for this amazing talk on communities. It's very insightful, especially for companies that actually want to build and create an impact. We have a few questions from Slido. So
Sure.
The first one, as you can see up there, is what would be your or a good North Star metric for a community to get internal alignment?
It's a great question. So at Amplitude, we have a North Star metric for our product, which is weekly saving users, how many people saved a chart that week. And it's changed over time, but saving is an interesting metric. And that, for me, is the most in line with the value that we want to create. And we want to get people to save charts. It's not everything that we will do, but if we can move the needle on our overall product North Star metric, then the company would be reasonably happy. If we made it like new opportunities for sales, then like no, not okay.
Thank you. Our next question is, does the clean membership require us to have costs to the members to keep them hooked?
I think it depends on the audience you're trying to reach and like why you've established this community. I think there are a lot of really interesting models that are paid, like there's a CFO community where you have to pay to be members. These like elite execy type communities, I know you have to pay, and it has like this, you know, you'll only meet people who are just like you in your journey, and that's important, I think, for some communities. For us, we think that everyone can be an analyst, and there are a lot of underrepresented groups that aren't being taught analytics in the way, or thinking about analytics the way they should be. And so we don't have a lot of like financial hoops and things. We have a lot of nerdy T-shirts. Like that's kind of our thing.
Nice. Is it worth to involve the company support organization into the communities?
Like, should companies get involved? Should vendors lead communities? Is this the question? Because not always. How involved should a company be?
I think the question is more like about the support organization, you know, like the customer support.
1,000% this. This is so much harder, right, than you think, because support teams are like the frontline defense. Like they are probably the hardest working team in the post-sales world of a company. And so asking them to do another thing and having a direct line with customers is a really big ask, even though they're the best person to answer it. So taking this decision is not like they're not like a chess piece. Like they have to be a totally bought-in stakeholder, and they have to know like how much is expected from them, and like how it's not meant to make their job harder. Because I think the support team ends up being like the dumping ground for a lot of these kinds of initiatives, and that's not the purpose at all.
Okay, we have time for just this last question. So, do you use third-party solution? Sorry. Do you use third-party or social platforms as the community home, or build your own spaces?
It's a good question. It's a good question. This goes back to like, why should your community exist? Why does the world need another, in our case, why does the world need another product community? The way that I think about this question is maybe less tools, but more like, where are people already? And like, what are you asking from them? Are they already in a happy community that's thriving and they just need a couple analytics experts? Then do that. Don't start another community and force people over to your own space. But if you find that there isn't a safe space to share best practices about a topic that tends to be sensitive, like analytics, it's kind of loaded. Oh, I'm not good at math. I don't want to ask this question. Then like maybe you need to build your own safe space. So like safety is like a really key element for, I think, any community, especially in an analytics one. And so we decided to have our own space. I think the moment we see a better, stronger, more thriving community somewhere else, like Measure, wondered a lot about that one, like then our efforts should be moved over into like supporting that community more than building our own.
Okay, Esther, thank you very much for being here with us. Can we give a round of
everyone.
applause to Esther?